Imagine being a Soviet air defense commander in the late 1950s. You're sitting in your command bunker deep beneath Moscow. Radar screens confirm what your intelligence officers have been reporting for weeks. An American aircraft is flying directly over your most sensitive military installations. It's photographing everything below with unprecedented clarity. You know exactly where it is. You can track its position in real time as it crosses from one radar sector to another. Your superiors are demanding action. Telephone lines from the Kremlin are burning with urgent orders, and you can do absolutely nothing about it. You scramble every available interceptor. You order missile batteries to fire even though you know they can't reach. You watch your best pilots push their aircraft to the absolute limit, climbing until their engines flame out, until their controls stop responding, until they fall back to Earth, having gotten nowhere close to the target. The intruder flies so high, it exists in a realm beyond your reach. A domain where the air is so thin your fighters gasp for oxygen and your missiles lose guidance. This wasn't science fiction. This wasn't propaganda. This was the operational reality created by one of the most revolutionary aircraft ever designed, the Lockheed U-2. And it fundamentally altered the balance of Cold War intelligence gathering in ways that still resonate today. The story begins with fear. Genuine, institutional fear inside the American intelligence community. The Second World War had ended with the United States holding an atomic monopoly. That advantage evaporated on August 29, 1949, when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. Western estimates had predicted Soviet nuclear capability wouldn't emerge until the mid-1950s, at the earliest. Intelligence agencies had completely miscalculated Soviet scientific and industrial capabilities. By 1953, the Soviets had tested a hydrogen bomb. Mastery of thermonuclear weapons years ahead of schedule. The United States now faced a nuclear-armed adversary about which it knew dangerously little, an opponent capable of destroying American cities, but whose intentions, capabilities, and deployments remained largely opaque. And the questions American planners needed answered were existential ones. How many bombers did the Soviets actually have? Where were their nuclear production facilities? What were their missile development capabilities? Traditional human intelligence networks inside the Soviet Union had been systematically dismantled through Stalin's paranoid purges. The few agents who survived provided fragmentary information that was difficult to verify and often contradictory. Signals intelligence could intercept communications and radar emissions, but couldn't tell you what was physically sitting on an airfield in Siberia. Satellite reconnaissance didn't exist yet, wouldn't become operational until 1960. What American planners desperately needed was visual confirmation. They needed to see what was actually there, not guess, not estimate, see it. No. Several tragic attempts had already proven the deadly limitations of trying with conventional aircraft. In April 1950, a U.S. Navy PB-4Y privateer was shot down over the Baltic Sea. All crew lost. In October 1952, an RB-29 was destroyed over the Kuril Islands. In July 1953, an RB-50 was shot down over the Sea of Japan. These incidents killed dozens of crew members. Each shoot-down increased diplomatic tensions and proved the same brutal point. Conventional aircraft couldn't penetrate Soviet airspace and survive. I find it remarkable how the intelligence community recognized that the solution required abandoning conventional thinking entirely. Military aviation had been evolving in one direction for decades. Faster, more heavily armed, more robust. But speed and armor were irrelevant if the aircraft got shot down anyway. What they needed wasn't a better version of what already existed. They needed something that could fly above the entire threat envelope, an aircraft that could exist in a vertical sanctuary beyond Soviet reach, where the air was too thin for fighters to follow and too high for missiles to reach. The question was whether anyone could actually build such a thing. Clarence Kelly Johnson was not a man who accepted the word impossible gracefully. A farm boy from northern Michigan who'd shown his first aircraft design to a university professor at age 13, Johnson had risen to lead Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works, a small, secretive engineering team in Burbank, California, that operated outside normal corporate bureaucracy. They'd already produced the P-80 jet fighter and the F-104, starfighter under compressed schedules that the rest of the industry considered reckless. In December 1954, Johnson received a contract with a mandate that would have been rejected by any conventional manufacturer. Design an aircraft capable of flying reconnaissance at 70,000 feet or higher. to give it enough range to overfly the Soviet Union's vast interior from bases in Western Europe or Turkey. Equip it with cameras that can resolve objects less than 3 feet across from that extreme altitude. Maintain stable flight in atmospheric conditions where most aircraft would disintegrate. And deliver the first flyable aircraft in 8 months. To appreciate how audacious this was, you need to understand what 70,000 feet actually means. At that altitude, atmospheric pressure drops to less than 1 pound per square inch. 99% of the atmosphere's mass is below you. Temperatures plummet to minus 60 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze hydraulic fluid and make metal brittle. The air is so thin that conventional control surfaces become nearly useless, or simply aren't enough air molecules to push against. Engines struggle to generate thrust. And without pressure protection, a pilot's blood would literally boil at body temperature. The aircraft would need fuel for missions lasting 9 or 10 hours while keeping weight minimal enough to reach those altitudes. Every pound of structure, every ounce of unnecessary equipment would directly reduce how high it could fly. It was a contradiction wrapped in an engineering problem. Johnson's solution was elegant because it was radical. He threw out every convention that had governed aircraft construction since the Wright brothers and started from a single concept. The U-2 would be a glider that happened to have an engine attached. That one idea drove every other design decision. The fuselage was essentially a fuel tank with a cockpit bolted on top and camera bays underneath. Nothing more. The wings stretched over 103 feet from tip to tip, longer than a Boeing 737's wingspan. They were built from aluminum alloy using techniques borrowed from sailplane construction. Stringers and ribs designed for minimum weight rather than maximum strength, so thin and flexible they'd visibly bend and flex during flight, sometimes deflecting several feet from their neutral position. The landing gear would have seemed absurd to any conventional aircraft designer. A bicycle configuration, 2 wheels along the fuselage centerline, one under the nose, one under the tail. The wings had no support at all. Before takeoff, small, detachable outrigger wheels called pogos were attached under each wing. They'd fall away during the takeoff roll once the wings generated enough lift. Landing was where things got interesting. Pilots had to set down on those 2 centerline wheels, keeping the wings level through aerodynamic control alone as the aircraft decelerated. Eventually, inevitably, one wingtip would sag and scrape the runway. Every single landing. It required exceptional skill, and it turned every recovery into a small act of controlled destruction. Total empty weight below 15,000 pounds. For perspective, an F-15 Eagle weighs 28,000 pounds empty with a wingspan of just 43 feet. The U-2 achieved its featherweight through ruthless elimination. No radar, no weapons, minimal avionics. Even the paint was reduced. Early models flew bare metal or matte black to save every possible ounce. The Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet, optimized for high altitude, that pushed the aircraft past 75,000 feet under ideal conditions. It produced over 10,000 pounds of thrust at sea level, though that diminished enormously in the thin air above. The engine couldn't even self-start. There wasn't enough onboard battery power to turn it over. Ground crews used external systems for every startup. Kelly Johnson had designed a machine that sacrificed everything: strength, durability, ease of handling, conventional safety margins in pursuit of one single capability: altitude. And on August 1st, 1955, he found out if his bet would pay off. Groom Lake, Nevada. A remote dry lake bed the CIA had selected specifically because it was far from prying eyes. A facility that would later become famous under a different name, Area 51. Test pilot Tony LaVeyre climbed into Article 341, the first U-2 ever built, for what was supposed to be a high-speed taxi test. Just roll down the runway fast, get a feel for the controls. Stop. That was the plan. The aircraft had other ideas. Those enormous wings generated so much lift that the U-2 simply left the ground on its own. LaVeyre found himself unexpectedly airborne in a prototype that had never been tested in flight. He managed a controlled landing, set down safely, and probably had a few words for the engineers afterward. That first flight came just 8 months after contract award. In a normal development program, they'd still be arguing about preliminary design reviews. The test flights that followed revealed something deeply unsettling about the aircraft Johnson had created. The U-2 was difficult to fly at any altitude. At operational ceiling, it was a knife's edge. At 70,000 feet, the margin between stall speed and maximum speed, the range of airspeeds where the aircraft could maintain controlled flight, narrowed to just 5 to 10 knots. Pilots called this the coffin corner. The name wasn't dramatic license, it was earned. Exceed maximum speed by even a small margin, and the thin wings could flex past their structural limits. They might fold upward. Control surfaces might rip away. The fuselage might simply break apart. Drop below stall speed and the aircraft would fall from the sky, entering an unrecoverable spin in air too thin for the controls to bite. 5 to 10 knots. That's the width of the safe zone at 70,000 feet. A gust of turbulence could kill you. And while threading that needle, pilots had to simultaneously operate multiple camera systems, navigate by celestial fixes and radio beacons, monitor fuel consumption, watch for contrails that might reveal their position, and scan for interceptors. All while wearing a pressure suit that felt like operating machinery inside a full-body cast. The CIA recruited fighter pilots from the Air Force the best they could find. Candidates with exceptional skills, calm temperament under stress, and the physiological resilience to handle extreme altitude. Even so, the training pipeline claimed lives. Multiple aircraft were lost. Several pilots were killed before the program ever flew an operational mission. The men who made it through knew exactly what they were signing up for. They understood that at 70,000 feet, alone over hostile territory, any mechanical failure could be fatal, and that help wasn't coming. President Eisenhower authorized the first overflights of Soviet territory in July 1956. He did it reluctantly. He understood the intelligence value, the critical need to determine Soviet bomber and missile capabilities, but he also understood the catastrophe that would follow if an aircraft went down. The Soviets would have physical proof of American espionage. It could parade a pilot before cameras. It could humiliate the United States before the world. Eisenhower personally approved each mission. He reviewed flight plans. He weighed intelligence value against political risk, and he imposed strict limits on how many missions could fly and how deep they could penetrate. The first mission launched on July 4, 1956. That date wasn't accidental. Pilot Harvey Stockman lifted off from Wiesbaden Air Base in West Germany, climbed to operational altitude, and crossed into East German airspace. His route took him over the Soviet submarine construction facilities at Leningrad, over the massive naval shipyards where the Soviet Union was building its submarine fleet, then across bomber bases in the Baltic military region. 9 hours later, Stockman landed with thousands of exposed frames of film. When the analysts developed those images, the room went quiet. Objects 18 inches across were clearly identifiable from 70,000 feet. Individual vehicles, aircraft types, weapon systems. You could count rivets on fuselages. You could identify individual people on the ground, from 14 miles up. The detail was unprecedented, revolutionary. It exceeded anything available from any previous reconnaissance platform by an order of magnitude. And for the Soviet air defense network, the implications were devastating. Soviet radar detected Stockman from the moment he crossed into East German airspace. Radar sites tracked his progress perfectly. Fighter bases received scramble orders. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft. None of it mattered. The radar data was flawless. The Americans weren't even trying to hide. But knowing exactly where the target was doesn't help when you can't reach it. The MiG-17 Fresco, the Soviet Union's frontline interceptor, had a service ceiling of 54,000 feet under ideal conditions. It's in practice, loaded with fuel and weapons for an actual intercept. It struggled to reach 50,000. The gap between its ceiling and the U-2's cruise altitude was roughly 5 miles of vertical separation, an impossible distance. The MiG-19 Farmer, introduced in 1955 as the Soviet Union's first supersonic fighter, could theoretically reach 60,000 feet. But only through a zoom climb, a desperate maneuver where the pilot accelerated at lower altitude, then pulled into a steep climb, trading speed for altitude. It was essentially ballistic. The aircraft wasn't flying. It was following a parabolic arc, like a thrown rock. The pilot might touch 58,000 feet for 5 to 10 seconds before stalling and falling back. During those seconds, he had to visually locate a target thousands of feet above him. establish a firing solution, and launch weapons, all while his aircraft was on the edge of losing control. Warning lights blazing, controls barely responsive. No MiG-19 pilot ever successfully engaged a U-2, though many tried. Some tried to fly in pairs, using one aircraft as a stepping stone for the other. This resulted in near collisions during training and never worked operationally. Soviet commanders launched mass intercepts. Dozens of fighters simultaneously from multiple bases, 50 aircraft spread across hundreds of miles of airspace, all climbing to their absolute ceiling. The U-2 sailed over every single one of them. Anti-aircraft artillery was even more futile. The largest guns to 130mm systems couldn't reach above 40,000 feet. Shells would arc up, peak, and fall back to Earth miles below the American aircraft. Some commanders ordered their batteries to fire anyway, not because they expected to hit anything, because doing nothing was unbearable. Soviet newspapers claimed heroic gunners had driven off American spy planes. Pure propaganda. The embarrassing reality was that nothing in the Soviet arsenal could touch the U-2, and the Americans knew it. The U-2 didn't attempt evasion. It didn't try to hide. It flew straight lines over targets. It circled back from multiple camera angles. Executed leisurely turns over secondary objectives. It operated as though Soviet air defenses simply didn't exist, because at 70,000 feet, they didn't. The psychological impact on Soviet leadership was profound, humiliating, for a nation that had emerged victorious from the deadliest war in human history, had built nuclear weapons and advanced jet fighters, presented itself as America's technological equal. The inability to stop a single unarmed aircraft from photographing their most sensitive installations cut deep. But the intelligence those cameras brought home may have prevented something far worse than embarrassment. It may have prevented a war built on a lie. Throughout the mid-1950s, American defense planners had been gripped by fear of a bomber gap. Western intelligence estimated the Soviets possessed hundreds of Myasishov M4 Bison and Tupolev Tu-95 Bear long-range bombers. These estimates were based largely on annual May Day parade observations, where the Soviets flew the same aircraft repeatedly past viewing stands to create the illusion of much larger numbers. The bomber gap had driven billions of dollars in American defense spending. It had been a major issue in the 1956 presidential election. It had shaped strategic planning and force structure decisions across the entire military. The U-2 photographs revealed the truth. By counting aircraft at known bomber bases, tracking production facilities, and monitoring deployment patterns, analysts determined the Soviets had built only a few dozen Bison bombers and a somewhat larger but still modest Bear fleet. The bomber gap existed, but in America's favor. The Soviet parade trick had worked, and it had cost American taxpayers tens of billions of dollars in unnecessary procurement. Conversely, the flights revealed something the intelligence community had underestimated: extensive ballistic missile development at remote sites, large construction projects, new road and rail infrastructure, testing ranges for weapons that would ultimately matter far more than bombers. The Soviets were betting their nuclear future on missiles, not aircraft. This intelligence prompted acceleration of American ICBM and SLBM programs and fundamentally shifted defense priorities. Airfields, naval facilities, nuclear production complexes, uranium enrichment plants, submarine yards, radar installations, all of it was systematically cataloged with a level of detail previously thought impossible. Could measure buildings, count vehicles, identify equipment types, track construction progress over time through repeat photography. For the first time, policymakers could make decisions based on what the Soviets actually had, not on worst-case estimates or Soviet deception. For 4 years, the U-2 flew with impunity, untouchable. But the Soviets were building something specifically designed to end that sanctuary. And when it worked, it would trigger one of the greatest espionage disasters in American history. If you're finding this deep dive valuable, hit subscribe and like the video. It helps the channel keep producing this kind of detailed content. Now let's talk about how the Soviets finally reached 70,000 feet. Between 1956 and 1960, the CIA flew approximately 30 major missions over Soviet territory, with dozens more over China, Eastern Europe, and other targets around the communist bloc's periphery. Each mission produced tens of thousands of photographs covering hundreds of miles. The intelligence windfall was enormous, but so was the cumulative diplomatic damage. Every overflight was a direct violation of Soviet airspace. Khrushchev was reportedly furious, viewing the flights as humiliating demonstrations of Soviet inferiority that undermined his attempts to project strength on the world stage. He personally directed the military to develop countermeasures, regardless of cost, limited resources for anything that could stop the Americans. The answer came not from faster fighters, but from a different weapon entirely: the S-75 Divina surface-to-air missile system, known in the West as the SA-2 guideline. The logic was elegant. A missile doesn't need to sustain flight at extreme altitude. It doesn't need to maneuver in thin air. It just needs to reach that altitude briefly while carrying a warhead and detonate close enough to send fragments through a fragile aircraft. No direct hit required. The SA-2 was large, over 5,000 pounds at launch. A two-stage propulsion system pushed it past Mach 3. Ground-based fan-song radar tracked both the target and the missile, transmitting guidance commands to close the gap. Maximum engagement altitude, approximately 80,000 feet. The Soviets also developed modified interceptors, the Sukhoi Sunim, the Yakovlev Yaku-8P, with enhanced high-altitude capability. But the fundamental problem remained. Even if a fighter reached you to altitude, it would be at the ragged edge of its envelope, barely controllable. The U-2 pilot would be cruising comfortably within design parameters. The interceptor pilot would be fighting his own aircraft. The missile was the real threat. By 1960, SA-2 battalions were deploying across the Soviet Union. May 1st, 1960, May Day, a holiday across the Soviet Union. Francis Gary Powers, a 30-year-old civilian CIA contract pilot from Jenkins, Kentucky, lifted off from Peshawar, Pakistan before dawn. His mission designation was 4154. His route would cross the entire Soviet Union to 3,800 miles from Peshawar to Bodø, Norway, the deepest penetration ever attempted. Intelligence analysts wanted photographs of suspected ICBM sites near Plesetsk and Turatom, nuclear facilities in the Urals, targets that couldn't be reached from safer peripheral routes. President Eisenhower had personally approved the mission despite growing reservations. He knew the summit meeting with Khrushchev in Paris was just weeks away. He knew the diplomatic stakes. He approved it anyway because the intelligence need was that urgent. Soviets tracked Powers from the moment he crossed into their airspace. Marshal Sergei Birzov, the air defense commander, monitored from Moscow. This time they had something new waiting. Near Sverdlovsk, on S-75 Battalion of the 57th Air Defense Division, Major Mikhail Voronov commanding, had recently achieved operational status. They had trained extensively on the new system. They'd never fired at a real target at extreme altitude. They were about to get their chance. Powers was flying at approximately 68,000 feet, slightly lower than optimal, possibly due to the aircraft's gross weight from full fuel tanks at the beginning of a long mission, possibly from unfavorable atmospheric conditions. Those few thousand feet would matter enormously. The battalion launched 3 missiles in rapid succession. The first missile's motor failed. It tumbled back to Earth. The second tracked reasonably well, but detonated too far from the target. The third detonated close enough. Fragmentation and blast effects tore into the U-2's tail section. Powers felt the aircraft shudder violently. Warning lights lit up across the instrument panel. He knew instantly he was in serious trouble. The aircraft was breaking apart around him. He tried to stabilize, tried to initiate emergency descent, but the U-2 entered an uncontrolled spin, tumbling through the thin air with increasing violence. Standard procedure dictated activating the destruct mechanism to destroy classified cameras and equipment, then ejecting. But Powers couldn't reach the destruct switches from his seat position. The tumbling was too violent to unbuckle and move around the cockpit. He made a split-second decision: bail out manually. He jettisoned the canopy, released his harness, and centrifugal force threw him clear of the spinning wreckage. His parachute opened. Francis Gary Powers began a long, slow descent through 40,000 feet of Soviet airspace. Plenty of time for every radar station in the region to track him. Plenty of time for recovery teams to converge on his landing point. He was captured within hours. There's a tragic footnote. In the chaos of the engagement, a MiG-19 pilot, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov, attempted a desperate zoom climb intercept despite orders to stay clear of the missile engagement zone. One of the later SA-2 missiles launched at Powers hit Safronov's aircraft instead. He was killed. Soviet authorities initially covered up the fratricide, attributing his death to combat with the American intruder. Even in their moment of triumph, confusion and poor coordination claimed one of their own. Khrushchev played what followed like a master. He announced to the world only that Soviet forces had shot down an American aircraft violating Soviet airspace. He deliberately withheld every other detail. He wanted to see what Washington would say. The Eisenhower administration took the bait. Operating under the reasonable assumption that the pilot was dead and the aircraft destroyed beyond recognition, they issued a carefully prepared cover story. A NASA weather research aircraft based in Turkey had gone missing, possibly strayed off course, possible oxygen system failure. The story was plausible. It was carefully crafted. It was completely wrong. Then Khrushchev sprung the trap. In a dramatic presentation to the Supreme Soviet, he revealed that they had the pilot alive. They had substantial wreckage. They had cameras loaded with exposed film. They had Powers' own statements confirming this was a CIA espionage mission. The American cover story collapsed in public on the world stage in spectacular fashion. Let that sink in for a moment. The planned Paris summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev fell apart. Khrushchev demanded an apology and permanent suspension of overflights. Relations between the superpowers hit a new low. Eisenhower, who had hoped to leave office having improved U.S.-Soviet relations, instead left with them worse than they'd been in years. The Powers incident is often mischaracterized as proving the U-2 was vulnerable. The reality is more nuanced and more important. No Soviet fighter shot down the U-2. Not in 1956. Not in 1960. After 4 years of intense effort, not a single interceptor could reliably reach a U-2 at cruise altitude. The MiG-21 entering service that same year still couldn't reach 70,000 feet in combat configuration. What brought Powers down was a missile, a new category of weapon designed specifically for the problem. Even then, it required favorable conditions. Powers was flying several thousand feet below optimal altitude. The missile that hit him was one of 14 launched during his transit across Soviet territory. Multiple SA-2 battalions attempted intercepts as he crossed their engagement zones. Most missiles failed to track. Others detonated too far away. Others suffered technical failures. The Soviets needed to throw enormous resources at the problem. Constant radar tracking across thousands of miles, coordinated missile batteries, multiple launches per engagement zone, and success was still probabilistic, not guaranteed. Dependent on multiple factors aligning favorably, but probable was enough. The political calculation had changed. Overflights of Soviet territory ceased permanently. The U-2 story didn't end over Sverdlovsk. 2 years later, it would provide the intelligence that arguably saved the world. In October 1962, U-2 photographs revealed Soviet missile installations in Cuba, nuclear-capable. SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles, positioned to strike most of the eastern United States. The images triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the Cold War ever came to becoming a hot one. For 13 days, the world balanced on the edge. On October 27th, Major Rudolph Anderson lifted off from McCoy Air Force Base in Florida on a reconnaissance pass over Cuba. He never came back. An SA-2 missile struck his aircraft over Baines. He was the only combat fatality of the crisis. And his death very nearly triggered the American military response that could have escalated to nuclear war. U-2 South continued flying missions over China throughout the 1960s. Several aircraft were lost to Chinese SA-2 batteries. They flew over Vietnam, North Korea, and numerous other locations throughout the Cold War and far beyond it. It's worth pausing on what it actually meant to fly this aircraft. The physical and psychological reality that the pilots lived with every mission. The pressure suit was essentially a personal spacecraft. It maintained pressure equivalent to 35,000 feet, even when the aircraft was at 70,000 or higher. Pilots had to pre-breathe pure oxygen for an hour before every flight, purging nitrogen from their bloodstream to prevent decompression sickness. A procedure borrowed from deep-sea diving and later adapted for spaceflight. The suit was uncomfortable, restrictive, and exhausting across 8 to 10-hour missions. Pilots lost pounds of water weight through perspiration. Helmet visors fogged. The thick gloves made switches and controls feel like operating machinery through boxing gloves. Every physical action took deliberate, focused effort. The aircraft's fuel system used a special low-pressure fuel that wouldn't boil at altitude, different from standard jet fuel, requiring dedicated handling procedures. The fragile airframe required special ground handling equipment and extensively trained maintenance crews. Every landing risked damage. Every landing required thorough inspection before the aircraft could fly again. And above all of it, the knowledge that at 70,000 feet, alone over hostile territory, you were 9 hours from help and 1 mechanical failure from death. Powers spent nearly 2 years in Soviet captivity before being exchanged. Anderson never came home at all. Multiple pilots died in training. The men who flew the U-2 understood the bargain they'd made, and they flew anyway. Here's the part of the story that still amazes me. The U-2 was designed in the mid-1950s as a temporary solution, a stopgap until satellite reconnaissance became available, something to fill a gap for a few years. It's still flying. The aircraft evolved continuously. The original U-2A gave way to improved variants. The U-2R, introduced in 1967, was essentially a new aircraft minus 70% larger airframe, longer wings. More powerful Pratt & Whitney J75 engine producing 17,000 pounds of thrust, payload capacity over 5,000 pounds of sensors. The current U-2S variant uses a General Electric F118 turbofan producing 19,000 pounds of thrust, operates above 80,000 feet and carries advanced avionics, satellite communications, near real-time data links, and modular sensor bays reconfigurable for different missions. No contemporary of the original U-2 came close. The British Canberra topped out at 48,000 feet. The modified American RB-57D could reach 65,000, but had limited range. Even after satellites arrived, the U-2 retained advantages satellites couldn't match: unpredictable timing, ability to loiter over targets, operation below cloud cover. Today, approximately 30 U-2's aircraft remain in service. They fly over conflict zones, monitor nuclear programs, provide battlefield reconnaissance, conduct signals intelligence. No other combat aircraft designed in the 1950s is still on the front line. Not one. Let's go back to that Soviet command bunker where we started. You're watching a single blip on your radar screen? An American aircraft flying straight and level over your most sensitive military installations? You have more fighters, more pilots, more air defense systems than the Americans could imagine. And none of it matters. The U-2 exists in a vertical space where your capabilities simply don't extend. That sanctuary lasted for years before your missiles caught up. But by then, the damage, if you want to call objective intelligence gathering damage, was done. The photographs had already proven the bomber gap was a fiction, already revealed the true shape of your missile programs, already given American planners the information they needed to make decisions based on reality rather than fear. The U-2 provided intelligence that prevented war, shaped defense policy for decades, verified arms control agreements, saved countless lives by replacing worst-case assumptions with photographic evidence. And the engineering philosophy behind it offers a lesson that extends beyond aviation. When Kelly Johnson faced an impossible requirement, he didn't try to build a better version of what already existed. He abandoned every convention and designed something entirely new, optimized without compromise for a single mission. The trade-off was fragility, difficulty, danger. But for that specific mission, the result was unmatched. The slender black aircraft with the impossibly long wings accomplished exactly what Johnson designed it to do. And 7 decades later, it's still out there. Still flying above the weather, above the noise, above almost everything else in the sky. Still gathering intelligence. Still proving that sometimes the most radical solution is the most enduring one.